Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. And today I'm going to be talking about a concept that was coined by Dr. Patrick Carnes called eroticized rage. But before I get started, please hit like and subscribe. You could leave a review. It is free for you to describe. You'll also see new content when it's available, and it helps me out. So back to this concept of eroticized rage. It's one of those terms that can sound clinical, but when you sit with it, and I have sat with it for years, thinking about it, seeing it when it shows up, you're going to realize that it describes something that actually shows up often in relationships and in therapy rooms. In this episode, we'll look at where the idea comes from, how it shows up, and most importantly, how healing is possible. Before we get started, I do want to offer a content warning. In this episode, I'll be talking about childhood sexual abuse, incest, attachment wounds, and the ways these experiences can shape adult sexuality and relationships. If these topics are triggering for you, please take care of yourself as you listen. That might mean pressing pause, skipping sections, or making sure you're in a safe and supportive place before you continue. If you're a survivor, remember you don't have to walk through this alone. Please reach out to a trusted friend, your therapist, or a support group can make a world of difference. My goal with this episode is not to sensationalize these issues, but to shine light on them with compassion and understanding. And at the end of the episode, we will end in a place of hope and healing. Okay, so let's get started. So a roadmap of what we're going to be talking about in this episode. I'll cover the history of how child sexual abuse was understood legally and culturally, what Dr. Carnes meant by eroticized rage, and how disrupted attachment plays into it, and how this often surfaces in adult relationships. I'll spend some time on the bigger picture, why this isn't about blaming moms, but instead understanding the impossible bind that many moms have been put in, and how trauma can ripple into the next generation. When I work with clients around eroticized rage, I often see early attachment disruptions playing out. And usually because the mother-infant bond is the first and most primary, that's where the story begins. I often say if attachment doesn't go well enough, from infancy forward, later, intimate and sexual relationships can feel like the first opportunity or the closest opportunity we get for a redo. I think that the nurturing and intimacy that should be there between a mother and infant can mimic the intimacy and closeness that happens with many sexual relationships. The problem is when that early pain gets triggered, it often doesn't show up as sadness or longing. The problem is that the redo actually doesn't work for most people because of the and the problem is that when that pain gets triggered, it often doesn't show up as sadness or longing. It shows up as rage that often is directed at the partner. So for those of you listening, if you want to read more about this, Dr. Carnes talks about this concept in several of his works. In his book, Contrary to Love, that came out in 1989, and then later in his book, The Betrayal Bond, which came out in 1997 and has also had a revised edition that came out around the 30-year anniversary of that book. So in those two books, Patrick Carnes describes eroticized rage as the fusion of anger and sexual arousal. And he explains that for some people, often survivors of childhood sexual abuse, anger, rage, and violation becomes sexualized within the arousal template. Now, if you're just hearing about Dr. Patrick Carnes and you haven't listened to a lot of my episodes, let me just give you a little backstory. Dr. Patrick Carnes is the world's leading expert on sexual addiction. So when he's talking about eroticized rage, it's often how it shows up for individuals who have developed compulsive sexual behavior disorder or sex addiction. He emphasizes that this is not just anger that's expressed sexually, but rather it's a conditioning process where rage provides a sense of power for someone who once felt powerless. The sexual charge makes the unbearable emotions of betrayal and trauma that happen early in life tolerable. And over time, rage and sexuality become linked so tightly that sexual expression may carry hostility, revenge, or domination. He also stresses the relational consequences. Eroticized rage often fuels compulsive sexual behavior that seeks intensity rather than intimacy, reinforcing secrecy, shame, and disconnection. So if we put his concepts together, Dr. Carnes's definition of eroticized rage is the fusion of anger and sexual arousal. It develops when experiences of violation and helplessness, often in childhood, get paired with sexual arousal. Rage gives a sense of power, while the erotic charge makes the pain tolerable. And over time, the two fuse, creating a template where sex and hostility intertwine. Instead of intimacy, sex becomes about intensity, revenge, or secrecy. For some people, this does show up as a compulsive sexual behavior disorder that has a hostile edge, rage underlying the acting out behavior. For others, it's not about addiction. It's not just sex addicts who can experience eroticized rage. For those who experience eroticized rage who do not have a sex addiction, it's about explosive rage that targets their partner, especially following moments of vulnerability or closeness. So as I said in my trigger warning, I want to talk now about the legal history in both the United Kingdom and the United States when it comes to childhood sexual abuse. In 1275, we have England's first statute that protected girls under 12 from being sexually abused. The age of consent was raised to 16 years old in both England and Wales. And then in 1908, incest was criminalized in England and Wales. In the US, ages of consent once were as low as 7 years old. They were raised gradually to between 16 and 18 years old by the early 20th century. I will state, though, in Utah, currently the age of consent is 14. So that's less than the 16 to 18 that it is in most states. In 1962, Dr. C. Henry Kemp published The Battered Child Syndrome, talking about what happens to kids who are physically abused. And then between 1963 and 1974, in the United States, we started to see mandatory reporting laws, first with physical abuse, and then later in 1974, a bill was passed titled CAPTA that made sexual abuse reportable. So I tell you this because I think what it tells us, this history, is that abuse was often hidden by family secrecy. Initially, these mandatory reporting laws would be stranger to the child. And we know that most perpetrators of childhood sexual abuse are known to the family, which made it often harmful for these kids to come forward, for them to talk about it. There may have not been any laws because they were being overlooked by the law. And without mandatory reporting until the 1960s and 70s, most abuse never came to light. That silence and stigma began shaping how trauma was carried and how rage and sexuality fused in secrecy. I don't think we can ever fully know the number of mothers who were sexually abused as children, who carried that shame and trauma forward with them and passed that along to their children. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but let's look at how attachment is at the root of rage. When the infant-mother attachment doesn't go well enough, we know that pain gets stored deep in the nervous system. And as I said, the next time we have access to that kind of intimacy is usually in sexual or romantic relationships. It's also where the old wound can resurface, first as longing, and then as rage when we start to feel the lack of safety around that level of intimacy. I work with a lot of clients who, based on their childhood story, they long for love. And it's also something that has eluded them well into their adult years. When love didn't come easily, what I see with clients is they often don't trust it when it starts to come, and they even fight against it and resist it. I'll say to clients, it's like you refuse to believe that you can truly experience it. So you get mad that this person made you think that you could or hope that you would. Now, a lot of this is happening in the subconscious. The rage isn't, but these underlying issues are happening in the subconscious. They're not present in awareness. So when we have disrupted or inconsistent primary attachment, it leaves unresolved pain, shame, and an unsoothed need for regulation. So let me map this out for a minute. So when we have disrupted or inconsistent primary attachment, and it leaves unresolved pain and shame and an unsoothed need for regulation, then we encounter this reenactment opportunity in our adult sexual and romantic relationships. They feel like the first place to get that redo of primary intimacy because they're intimate, vulnerable contexts that are available. However, it's never going to look like it would had we not had that original wound. And so when attachment pain is triggered, it often mobilizes older, more primitive neural systems, the fight, flight, and rage, before the cortex can self-regulate. I'll have clients describe this as something that they can't even fathom when they're sitting in my office. They can tell me about it, but when they're sitting there, they're like, I can't even believe I did that. I don't even fully remember it. And sitting here now, I don't think I'll ever do it again. But I do. It's this reptilian surge. And there's a displacement of this pain and anger and rage onto the partner who's standing as a substitute for mom. The sexual partner becomes the target of that shame and that abandonment pain. And the emotional energy arrives as rage rather than a request for comfort or deep sorrow. So eroticization, with or without addiction, is rage that's erotically charged. For sex addiction clients, we'll often see similar attachment roots, but with the addition of compulsive sexual behaviors, secrecy, and escalation to try to manage their dysregulation. In non-addiction clients, the pattern can still be highly destructive to intimacy, even if is absent any compulsive sexual behaviors. So here's what I've noticed in working with clients, how non-addict clients and their eroticized rage differs from my clients who have been diagnosed. There's a difference between the intensity and the pattern. Non-addict clients may show episodic, relationship-focused, explosive rage tied to attachment triggers. And sex addiction clients add compulsive sexual acting out or objectifying patterns to the rage template. Sometimes for sex addict clients, their partners aren't even aware how they act out this rage. And it's enough for those clients to know how the partner would feel when they do what they do, even if they never actually tell the partner, at least during the acting out. I mean, if we're in treatment, that's going to come out in a disclosure, but we will see with sex addicts that often in their compulsive sexual behavior, that is where the eroticized rage comes out. They also might rage at their partner directly in non-sexual ways, but the intensity and the pattern are different between the two types of clients. Also, there's a difference between compulsivity. In addiction, sexual behavior is used repeatedly to manage distress, despite its negative consequences. For non-addict clients, eroticized rage, the sexual system may be entangled with anger, but it's not necessarily compulsive. Both have shame and secrecy, both types of clients, but sex addiction often has an established pattern of hiding behaviors that reinforce the betrayal dynamics. Both types of clients will benefit from attachment-focused repair work, with sex addiction clients often needing relapse prevention, accountability structures, and a specific plan to interrupt their acting out cycles. So let's talk now about rage as a reptilian brain response. I often will tell clients that rage is a combination of emotions. It isn't just anger squared or anger times 100 or 1,000. Rage is a combination of fear, shame, anger. And when we go into rage, often people will report, or those watching them will report, that they were literally out of their minds, out of their rational minds for sure. The reptilian brain response is primitive, it's fast, and it's overwhelming. Instead of a request for comfort, it comes out as an attack on the partner. I will often tell clients that anger is healthy. It's a protective emotion, and anger can be expressed and witnessed. Rage, on the other hand, blasts the partner, comes out as an attack, and it's really hard for the person on the receiving end of rage to stay regulated or respond in a way that doesn't add to the disconnection. The work has to be in separating those two things, anger and rage. So let's go back to how a mother's sexual abuse history can shape attachment with their own babies and infants and children. And again, we don't know the numbers for this. I'm not saying it's the only reason there's an attachment disruption, and I'll talk about some of the other reasons. But let's talk about how a mom's sexual abuse history shapes her ability to attach with her babies. So when a mom has a history of sexual abuse, that trauma can show up in her bond with her children. It might look like shame for her that makes it harder to feel safe and present. It can also look like beliefs that she projects about men or women. She projects them onto her baby boy or her baby girl, and that goes forward with them as they grow up. Sometimes it shows up as being hyper alert, or it can also show up as being checked out emotionally, which makes it harder to read a baby's cues accurately. Now, this doesn't mean that every survivor of sexual abuse will struggle as a parent. Many don't, but it's one of the layers that can underlie attachment disruption. And the hope is when we name it, healing and repair become possible. As I said, sexual abuse is just one powerful possible contributor to disrupted attachment. And I don't even know that we'll ever know the number of mothers who experienced childhood sexual abuse as a child. The shame, what we do know is the shame and distorted beliefs that come from that trauma can shape the way she sees both males and females. And that can spill over into the bond she has with her children. So, for example, if her abuser was male, she may carry a deep fear or distrust of men, and that can make it harder to connect with a baby boy. And as that baby boy starts to grow up, mom has more anger at him as he becomes a boy into a young man, into a man. Or if she was taught to feel shame about her own body and sexuality, it may impact how she bonds with her baby girl, often trying to control her young daughter's sexual development. She might shame her body as it starts to age and hit puberty. She may be projecting onto that daughter her own blame of being complicit in her sexual abuse. And like I've said, I want to be clear, this isn't the only thing that underlies attachment disruption. There are many layers, from a lack of financial and emotional support. We know that poverty impacts this ability to attach well, to systemic pressures on moms. All I'm saying is that sexual abuse can leave scars that ripple forward into parenting, creating subtle barriers in those earliest bonds. And when I talk about disrupted mother-infant attachment, I want to be clear. I'm not blaming anybody, and I'm certainly not blaming moms. I'm a mom myself, and I know that moms are often handed an enormous job without the support they need, emotionally, financially, socially, and in terms of equality with their partners. When society doesn't value caregiving, When workplaces don't offer family leave or flexible schedules, when mothers are carrying the lion's share of emotional labor without support, it is so much harder for anyone to show up consistently for their child. Our culture undervalues caregiving. We make it harder for moms to succeed, and then we criticize them when the child's needs go unmet. We don't value the emotional labor and mental labor involved with mothering, not in a way that we're actually going to pay women to do that. When we value things, we assign a financial value to them. Now, in religion, it will assign a value to mother, often saying it's what you're made to do, it's what God wants from you, it's the most important thing you can do. But then, because we're made to do it, or really because women are primarily the ones doing it, and we don't value women in patriarchal societies, we don't give financial value to this work. I think it's important to name both. Yes, moms can leave incredible attachment wounds. And yes, the system often failed that mother too, both when she was a little girl and when she became a mother. So while a client may experience that as a very real attachment wound, I also hold compassion for the impossible bind that many mothers have been in. The goal in talking about this isn't to point a finger, but it's to understand how those early dynamics shape us and how healing can happen when we name both the personal pain and the larger systemic context. If you're listening and you're a mom, I want you to take a moment to notice how the support you had or didn't have shaped your ability to show up for your child. And do that with compassion and not critique. So as I've talked about, clients with eroticized rage tend to get hypervigilant about the evidence that their partner doesn't love them or that their partner is smothering them. They truly believe their threat response is accurate. I think it's very important when you're working with these clients or when you're working with a therapist that that therapist has established a safe, therapeutic, trusting relationship with the client, because you're going to have to lean on that to do the work that is needed for healing. I think one of the first things in helping clients heal from eroticized rage is helping them understand what it is, how it develops, where it comes from, in a safe, non-judgmental way. Often they don't like what they're doing. They hold a lot of shame about it themselves. And starting to have these conversations and opening up has to be a very safe, non-judgmental process. I've done this work sometimes with just the individual client that I have, the male client that I have who is raging. And I want to say here too, does eroticized rage happen for women? Yes. Yes, it does. In our society, though, we really don't like women to feel anger, and we're not going to tolerate their rage at all. So I think women tend to express their eroticized rage in a very passive aggressive way, heavy on the aggressive, but also on the passive. So it comes out differently for women than it will for men. I think the way that we have to talk about it and identify it is still the same. Has to be a safe, non-judgmental atmosphere. We have to be able to help them understand what this is, that this is actually rage. This isn't just anger that is being stigmatized against you. This is actually rage. And that people don't respond well to rage. People are not going to understand or respond well when you're raging at them. So we help them understand what's happening. We help them have awareness when it is happening, what it looks like for them. And we do this in ways that are non-judgmental and safe. And then we have to help them distinguish anger from rage. One of the ways I do this is I will say anger it's a healthy emotion. It's a signal that something is off, that something important was violated. Anger as an emotion itself doesn't have to be really big. It doesn't have to be scary. I think a lot of people think of anger as a very scary emotion. They're afraid of their anger. I know I went through that for a time period where I was afraid of my anger. And I think because I didn't learn about healthy anger growing up, my anger was sometimes big and uncontrolled. And I might have gone into some rage a few times. I think for me, because I was afraid of my anger, I often just shoved it down and stifled it and didn't let myself get angry at all. Now, today, and after years of reclaiming my voice and reclaiming anger, I think I have a much healthier relationship with my anger and understand that anger is a good emotion. We need it. It's part of our ability to keep ourselves safe and protected. I often say that anger requires action. It wants us to do something. It's not an emotion where we feel a lot of anger that we just go to sleep and then it passes. It might, but it's going to come back. It might pass if we go to sleep for an hour or so, but it's going to come back because really anger is that alert system operating in our body that says something's happening. You need to keep yourself safe, whether that's setting a boundary, removing yourself from a situation, communicating a boundary, communicating needs, being assertive. Anger also can clarify things. So in many ways, anger is a healthy emotion that we need. Rage, on the other hand, as I said, is a fusion of fear and anger and shame. So we have anger, that healthy signal that something important was violated or that we're not safe, amplified by the fear of abandonment and the shame of unworthiness, not being enough, not being lovable, not being valuable. How rage functions is we move to protection through attack, and the outcome tends to be destructive, disconnecting, and a relational rupture. So now that I've talked about what rage is, let me be kind and rewind and remind you what I just said about anger. Anger is a healthy signal. It's a healthy emotion. It's our body's alert system saying, hey, something's up, pay attention, be alert. Something was violated, a boundary was violated, and anger is asking us to take action, communicate a need, communicate a boundary, walking away. The outcome tends to be clarity about a situation, about a person, and assertiveness, standing up for ourselves, advocating for ourselves, speaking up, using our voice. When we confuse anger and rage, often it's the people we love who end up on the receiving end of pain. And it's the pain that comes from really old wounds. True healing happens when our partner can witness our anger, not absorb the blast of our rage. That is a really hard thing that we are asking our partner to do. So I'll often, if I'm working with a couple who has a history of rage, I tell them usually in the first session, if I know that they're coming in with a rage issue in their relationship, I'll tell them it's going to show up here at some point. It often doesn't show up in the first couple of sessions, but it's going to show up in a session. And I tell them that's okay. I need to be able to work with it in real time. I need to be able to see both of you in real time and work with each of you in real time when the rage is present. And when there's a session and the rage comes up, I often remind them. Sometimes they'll say, I didn't think this was going to happen here. And I'll say, I did. Remember, I told you it's going to show up here. And that's okay, because I need it to. We need to work with it in real time. Trying to reduce their shame and the fear of what happens when their rage shows up. Because the good news is that rage isn't the enemy. Rage is a message about an old wound. And with the right tools, people can learn to recognize it in themselves. They can calm that primitive reptilian brain, and they can begin to repair instead of just repeating these outbursts of rage. Intimacy becomes less about reenacting the original wound and more about creating something safe and healing in the present that you do deserve and that you actually trust. So this is where I will tell people, let's move your partner so they're not across from you. Let's move them to the side of you. They're usually sitting parallel to each other, so they're not, they're directly across from me. And if you know anything about family systems theory and how triangulation, which isn't usually a healthy thing, and we bring a third person into this dynamic to try to alleviate some of the tension in conflict between two people, we bring in a third, which creates a triangle of people instead of the back and forth duality dynamic. In therapy, though, often the therapist will step in as the third person and triangulate the couple so that the communication is starting to come to the therapist from one, out to the other person, back from this person to the other person, trying to manage and slow down the conversation, trying to slow down and manage the emotions, the words, and bring it back to safety. I will tell clients, it will be powerful for you to let your partner witness your anger, not your rage that's directed at them. That's powerful in a not good way. But when they can witness your anger next to you, I've seen partners put their hand on their partner's back and just trace their fingers back and forth on their back, saying things like, yeah, you didn't deserve this. As the person is getting angry, how could you do this to me? I was only a kid. That's what anger sounds like. That was not okay. If I'm working with an individual client, as they're talking about this, I'll witness. I'll be the witness. I'll encourage them to share with their partner if they have one. But when I've been a witness, I've said things like, who does that? I've said things like, it's not that hard to be nice to your kid. So I'm validating their anger. I'm validating how big it is for them and how wrong their experience was, and allowing them to express that in a way that is healthy, in a way that clears things up. It provides clarity. They're being assertive as they're expressing that anger and giving it voice, and it makes space for their needs in their relationship and for their partner to actually step in and be relational with them in a way that starts to repair, in a way that starts to heal attachment. Because the good news is that rage isn't the enemy. Rage is a message about an old wound. And with the right tools, people can learn to recognize it in themselves. They can see it when it starts to come, and they can calm the primitive reptilian brain and begin to repair instead of repeat their rage cycles. When that happens, intimacy becomes less about reenacting the old injury and more about creating something safe and healing in the present. It's reclaiming something that they never thought they could actually have. Often I will tell clients, sometimes I don't need to tell clients, they've taken the steps themselves, or they just know to do this. But sometimes I will tell clients, when we're doing this work of healing the rage and allowing yourself to feel anger, we have to have a plan for how we manage your parents. If they're still alive, what are we going to do here? So that when you're in this vulnerable place and you're working on these really core issues, what happens if they send you a text, if they call you one day? Often these parents are still not the parents they need. So usually they'll move to set a boundary there, let their parents know, hey, I'm working on some deep stuff in therapy right now, and I need to have a break from any communication with you. Sometimes they'll let their parents know, I'm going to be blocking you. Not forever. It usually doesn't need to be forever. With a lot of clients, I usually see it at around 2 years that they need that safe space away from their parents before they can start to re-engage. And when they do re-engage, it is with boundaries. Brene Brown talks about how in her research, she found that the most compassionate people were also the most boundaried people. And anger often brings clarity about what our boundaries need to be. So when we're doing that work, it can be helpful to have a pretty firm boundary with parents of no contact. And then once we reestablish contact, we still have boundaries moving forward. Thanks for listening to this episode today. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might benefit. Check out the link in the show notes for a free download on how to start addressing the rage and moving it more into anger and healing. And remember, healing happens when we can hold both truth and compassion, both for ourselves and for those who raised us. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. Remember, there's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.